When you think of Van Gogh, you probably imagine bright colors, swirling brushstrokes, and vivid landscapes such as glowing sunflowers and star-filled skies. Yet almost no one understands his most mysterious painting, one that may have marked the beginning of the thick, expressive brushstrokes that became his signature style. Van Gogh wrote hundreds of letters to his brother Theo, carefully describing nearly every painting he produced. Strangely, however, he never mentioned this one. Vincent van Gogh's Skull of a Skeleton with Burning Cigarette, 1885 to 1886, is one of the most unusual works in his entire career. The small painting shows a human skeleton's skull and shoulders against a dark background, with a lit cigarette casually held between its teeth. Though simple in composition, the image is strangely powerful. Its mixture of humor, death, and quiet rebellion has made it one of the most puzzling works in Van Gogh's early output. The art enthusiasts have proposed several interpretations of the painting. Some believe it was a satirical critique of the rigid academic art training Van Gogh experienced in Antwerp. Others see it as a modern version of the traditional Memento mori, a reminder of mortality. Another interpretation views the work as a reflection of Van Gogh's dark sense of humor and playful personality. However, other researchers and art enthusiasts see a deeper and much darker meaning that may have been overlooked for more than a century. Thank you for supporting this channel. Each like and subscription contributes meaningfully to the preservation and advancement of real, authentic art in an era increasingly saturated with algorithmically generated AI content. Our mission is to support, celebrate, and promote art created by human hands and human imagination. Now, let's begin our analysis. Historical context: Antwerp and Van Gogh's early career. Van Gogh painted Skull of a Skeleton with Burning Cigarette in the winter of 1886 while studying at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Antwerp, Belgium. At this stage in his career, Van Gogh was still developing as an artist. His famous bright colors and expressive brushwork had not yet appeared. Instead, he worked in darker tones and focused heavily on drawing and anatomy. The Academy emphasized traditional academic training, which required students to study the human skeleton before drawing live models. This practice was intended to teach artists how the body was constructed. Van Gogh disliked the system intensely. He often complained that academic art education was rigid and uninspiring. He felt that it prioritized technical rules over genuine artistic expression. This period of his life was also marked by personal grief. Less than a year ago, Van Gogh's father, Theodorus van Gogh, had died suddenly. The loss was devastating for him and created tension within the family. Some art enthusiasts believe that this encounter with death deepened Van Gogh's reflections on mortality and likely influenced the mood of the painting. Around this same period, Van Gogh also created a simple but haunting sketch known as Hanging Skeleton and Cat, which shows a suspended skeleton observed by a curious cat. This drawing mirrors Van Gogh's internal mood and grief. The cat, often associated with the living world, calmly stares at the lifeless body, emphasizing the contrast between life and death. Together, these works suggest that Van Gogh was repeatedly exploring skeletal imagery not only as an academic exercise, but as a way of confronting mortality from different emotional angles. At the Academy, skeleton studies were a normal classroom exercise. Students regularly drew bones and anatomical models. Van Gogh likely painted the skeleton from one of these classroom specimens. However, painting it with a cigarette was not part of the assignment. The cigarette transforms the painting from a simple anatomical study into something far more complex. It introduces humor, irony, and ambiguity. The painting therefore reflects a moment when Van Gogh was both learning traditional methods and quietly rebelling against them. The first layer of meaning, a satirical critique of academic art education. One of the most widely accepted interpretations of the painting is that it represents a satirical critique of academic art training. Art historians believe Van Gogh may have created the work as a humorous response to the strict methods used in the academy. The academic system treated skeleton studies as essential preparation for serious art. By inserting a cigarette into the skeleton's mouth, Van Gogh undermines the seriousness of the exercise. The skeleton represents the academic model, rigid, lifeless, and purely technical. Van Gogh believed art should convey life and emotion, not just anatomical accuracy. In this sense, the skeleton embodies everything he disliked about academic art. The cigarette becomes the punchline of the visual joke. It adds personality to the otherwise lifeless figure. Instead of serving as a neutral study object, the skeleton appears relaxed, almost casual. Some scholars describe the painting as Van Gogh thumbing his nose at the artistic establishment. By transforming a dull study into a humorous image, he demonstrates his independence from academic conventions. This interpretation fits well with Van Gogh's personality. Throughout his life, he resisted traditional artistic expectations and sought more expressive ways of painting. The second layer of meaning, a modern memento mori. Another major interpretation connects the painting to the long European tradition of vanitas or memento mori art. In the 16th and 17th centuries, many Dutch and Flemish artists created paintings featuring skulls, extinguished candles, and other symbols of mortality. These works reminded viewers that life is temporary and that death is inevitable. Van Gogh, as a Dutch artist, would have been familiar with this tradition. The skull itself clearly symbolizes death. However, the burning cigarette introduces a new element: time. A cigarette burns slowly until it disappears into smoke and ash. In literature and visual symbolism, smoking is often interpreted as a metaphor for fleeting life. The smoker inhales smoke that slowly destroys the body, making each breath a reminder of mortality. In this sense, smoking can be understood as inhaling death, a quiet and gradual movement towards decay. Within the painting, the cigarette becomes a powerful symbol of this idea. Like the cigarette, human life burns down over time until nothing remains. The cigarette also reflects a shift toward modern industrial life. In earlier paintings, people typically smoked pipes, which were associated with tradition and stability. Van Gogh instead depicts a cigarette, a newer, cheaper, mass-produced alternative. In this way, the skeleton brings together existential emptiness, a fleeting escape from industrial poverty, and the traditional symbolism of memento mori. The image, therefore, contains a subtle philosophical message. The skeleton represents the final outcome of life, while the cigarette represents the short span of living experience that precedes it. Yet, unlike traditional vanitas paintings, Van Gogh's work is not solemn. The skeleton seems oddly relaxed. Instead of confronting death with fear or sadness, the image suggests a strange, calm acceptance. The third layer of meaning, a reflection of Van Gogh's personal struggles. Some scholars interpret the painting as a reflection of Van Gogh's own emotional and physical struggles during this period of his life. The mid-1880s were difficult years for Van Gogh. He experienced financial hardship, poor health, and uncertainty about his artistic future. The recent death of his father had also left a deep emotional mark on him. Van Gogh was also a heavy smoker. In letters to his brother Theo, he even mentioned smoking to cope with hunger and stress during periods of poverty. Seen in this context, the smoking skeleton may contain an element of self-irony. The figure could represent the artist himself, exhausted, unhealthy, but still stubbornly alive. The cigarette becomes more than a casual detail. In literature and art, smoking often symbolizes self-destruction, existential fatigue, and the slow wearing down of the body. Each cigarette represents time being consumed and life gradually shortening. Even in a skeletal state, the figure continues its small human habit. The act suggests endurance but also quiet resignation. This interpretation transforms the painting into something deeply personal. It becomes not just a joke or symbolic image, but a reflection of the artist's own condition. The fourth layer of meaning, dark humor and the playful side of Van Gogh. Despite its grim subject, the painting also reveals Van Gogh's sense of humor. Many museum descriptions describe the work as a juvenile joke, suggesting that the artist painted it partly for amusement. The humor arises from the contradiction at the center of the image. A skeleton represents death, yet smoking is a distinctly human habit associated with relaxation or social behavior. But the humor also carries a darker undertone. Because smoking itself is often linked with decay and mortality, the image becomes a visual paradox, a skeleton smoking the very object that slowly leads to death. This strange combination produces a dark comic effect. The skeleton appears almost mischievous, as if it is enjoying its cigarette despite already being dead. Some modern viewers interpret the image as playful or cheeky rather than frightening. The glowing cigarette tip and curling smoke give the skull a surprising sense of life. Interestingly, Van Gogh returned to the motif of skulls later in his career, but approached them in a more positive way, almost laughing at the absurdity of life and death. Later, skull paintings are painted with lively, vivid colors, highlighting the striking contrast between Van Gogh's everyday struggles and the vitality he infused into his art. This evolution reveals how the skull, traditionally a symbol of death, became a remarkably versatile motif, capable of conveying both dark humor and an unexpectedly life-affirming vitality at once. This interpretation reminds us that Van Gogh was not always the tragic figure often portrayed in popular culture. He also had a playful imagination and occasionally used humor in his art. The fifth and final layer of meaning, Gothic and macabre artistic traditions. Another layer of interpretation connects the painting to the broader tradition of macabre imagery in European art. Throughout history, artists have used skeletons and skulls to explore themes of death, fear, and the unknown. One famous example is the medieval and Renaissance theme known as the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, in which skeletons appear as animated figures interacting with the living. Some art historians believe Van Gogh's smoking skeleton echoes this tradition. Scholars have noted that Van Gogh was studying works by artists such as Hans Holbein during this period, whose prints often depicted skeletal figures in ironic or satirical scenes. In these earlier works, skeletons were not merely symbols of death. They often behaved like living characters, dancing, playing instruments, or interacting with humans. Van Gogh's painting fits naturally into this tradition. His skeleton is not passive. The cigarette gives it a personality, transforming it into a strange hybrid between life and death. Once again, the cigarette deepens the symbolism. It represents the slow burning passage of time, reinforcing the idea that life gradually consumes itself. Visual analysis. Beyond its symbolism, the painting is also interesting from a purely visual standpoint. The composition is extremely simple. The skeleton's head and upper torso are positioned against a dark background, which isolates the figure and draws the viewer's attention directly to the skull. The bones are painted in muted tones, off-whites, greens, and browns, while the background remains almost black. This contrast creates a dramatic spotlight effect. The cigarette becomes the only bright element in the image. Its glowing ember introduces a small point of warm color. This tiny detail dramatically changes the emotional tone of the painting. Without the cigarette, the painting would simply be a study of bones. With it, the image becomes mysterious, humorous, and slightly unsettling. Conclusion. Skull of a skeleton with burning cigarette may appear simple, but it contains a remarkable number of possible meanings. Painted in Antwerp around 1885 to 1886 during Van Gogh's academic training, the work reflects a moment when the artist was still searching for his own artistic voice. Art enthusiasts have proposed many interpretations of the image. Some see it as a satire of rigid academic art education, while others interpret it as a modern memento mori about the inevitability of death. Still others view it as a reflection of Van Gogh's personal struggles, a demonstration of his dark humor. or a reference to the macabre traditions of European art. The painting's power lies in the fact that all these interpretations can exist at once. The skeleton represents death and tradition. The cigarette represents life, habit, and fleeting time. It is also a reminder that life slowly burns away, much like the cigarette itself. Together they form a paradox, a dead figure performing a living act. In this paradox, we see something essential about Van Gogh's art. Even in a skull, he finds a spark of life. Thank you for watching. Your support helps sustain and promote authentic human creativity in an era increasingly shaped by soulless AI-generated content. We remain committed to our mission of preserving the value, depth, and originality of art created by real humans and human imagination. We look forward to seeing you in the next video.